Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to talk a little bit about housing and affordability and homelessness, etc. As we've just finished our conversation. I think that housing shelters are an important, critical, temporary solution, but they're not the long-term solution. I think that the long-term solution are two things. Number one, that we need more housing generally. Just general lack of affordability is caused by demand that exceeds supply, basic economics, and we need more housing generally to bring the average level of housing down. And I do think that smart developers will ensure that they meet different market segments as housing goes down. So there'll be housing for the rich, there'll be housing for middle income, and there'll be housing for people lower down the income scale if we make it easier to build homes. And I think that is a whole bunch of different things that I'll come back to and address in a minute. But then I think number two, there really is a issue at the bottom of the income scale because land is so expensive in the Greater Toronto Area, and we do really risk the potential of a Manhattanization of Toronto, where you have to be middle income or higher income to be able to afford any kind of housing in the Toronto area or in any reasonable length of commute time to the Toronto area. And I think that's a real problem, because I think that Toronto as a community needs to have all income levels here to be the economic engine of Canada, a wonderful place to live, the diversity of different people, restaurants, culture, arts, everything that you want to discuss, that you need to have different places available. And I think government needs to get involved to a greater degree. It doesn't have to do it on its own, but it can do it in partnership with the private sector, probably best done in partnership with the private sector. And I don't think regulation necessarily is the solution. In fact, regulation too often ends up being a problem. So rent controls, I think, have been proven over and over again, actually mean that you get less rental stock built. And so therefore rental might help the people that are already in rental apartments by restricting the ability to increase rents on the buildings that are already built. But what it does is it forces all the new people or incentivizes all the new developers to not build rental housing. And, I was just in a conversation last week where people were talking about rental housing, and they said, but, we don't have rent controls if it's a new building, but what's going to stop any government from changing that law and putting rental rent controls on? So that's not the solution. I think inclusionary zoning could be and should be a potential solution, but you've got to incentivize people to do it. And I think the key on that, and I've heard this from numerous different planners and architects, is people don't notice height the way that politicians and city planners and frankly some media personalities believe they do. When it's over above 5-6 stories, you don't really notice whether it's 40 or 50 or 60 stories high. And so therefore giving developers the ability to build an extra 5, 10, 15, 20 stories is almost giving them that ability for free. And so therefore giving them that extra height, that extra density in exchange for building some cheaper housing, some inclusionary zoning, I think makes a ton of sense. I think there are other ways like that. I do think that governments have got a lot of land, and selling that land for a buck to a developer in exchange for an obligation that they build a certain amount of inclusionary zoning or cheaper housing, I think is key. I think a lot, building and giving them access to lands above subway stations, LRT stations, GO train stations, or in close proximity, etc., and having height is another way, because in those locations, by definition, you're going to need a lot less cars and parking and make things more inexpensive. So I think that government's involvement in incentivizing the private sector to provide social housing, inclusionary zoning, more affordable housing makes a ton of sense. But then come back to number one. Number one is we just need more housing. I think that the amount of red tape, the development fees, the length of time to get approval, the regulatory process, the over-involvement of planning departments in second guessing almost anything that builders and developers want to do, and local homeowners, if they want to put in a granny suite or a laneway house or a second suite or something like that, third suite, etc. I think really have not been helpful. And I got to come back to another example. I think with Airbnb, with Uber, with travel agencies, with so many different segments of our society, consumers have voted that they actually don't think government regulation is helpful. They think that the private marketplace and mass sort of evaluations can do a better job than hotel inspectors or taxi regulation, etc. And I think that's probably true in housing as well. If a condo developer gets a bad name for building crappy stuff, he's not going to sell stuff in the future if he sells the original stuff to start with. And I don't think that planning people need to be as involved. I don't think the regulatory process needs to be as long. I don't think we need to have the longest regulatory approval process in the Western world in Toronto. It's not helped us. It's harmed us. Development fees are a tax on newcomers, on renters, on young people, and are wrong. It's a social development fees are to pay for social goods that should be paid for by all of society, not just by new homeowners. And I think that has made new home ownership way too expensive, new home building way too expensive. I think the government, local governments particularly, have been far more of the problem here than the solution. And some of our local politicians have got to realize that they've actually harmed the level of affordability. They've made it impossible for my kids to afford a house in the Greater Toronto area, or if not impossible, pretty damn difficult. And what they're doing in restricting height and restricting density and restricting and making it longer, far longer to actually get approvals for developments haven't really helped us. They may have helped some NIMBYs that don't want stuff nearby them, but they have harmed our community, and they've really harmed those people that want to buy a home for the first time, and they've harmed the general level of affordability, and they've harmed supply. And basic demand and supply, Economics 101 tells you that if you restrict supply dramatically and demand is what it is, price is going to go up, and that's what's happened. And government has been the failure on this. We have to admit it. We have to realize it. We have to take action to change it. That's my 2 cents. Thanks. Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for Saga 960. Good night, everybody.